Socrates didn't look like a revolutionary. He wasn't a general or a lawgiver. He was an older man in a plain cloak who wandered Athens and talked to anyone who would stop. Politicians, poets, craftsmen, rich sons with too much leisure, and strangers who didn't yet know what a mistake it was to answer his questions. And yet, Athens, the proud democracy of Greece, put him on trial and sentenced him to death. To see why, you have to understand the kind of truth-teller Socrates was. He didn't shout slogans or lead a faction. He did something more irritating. He made people feel certain, and then made them realize they didn't know what they were talking about. His weapon was conversation. The technique, later called the Socratic method, looks simple and feels brutal. Socrates asks you to define a virtue, justice, courage, piety, moderation. You answer confidently. He agrees, praises the clarity, and asks, "So is that always true?" Then he offers an awkward example, a tricky exception, a case that doesn't fit. He keeps going until your definition collapses. That isn't just disagreement, it's public embarrassment. In Athens, reputation was currency. Socrates didn't merely oppose you, he made you look foolish in front of your friends. Worse, he did it politely, as if he were the student and you were the expert. If Athens had a talent for anything, it was turning personal annoyance into public grievance. Socrates claimed he had a mission. The story goes that a friend asked the oracle at Delphi whether anyone was wiser than Socrates, and the oracle said no. Socrates didn't take it as praise, he took it as a riddle. He went out to test it by questioning people who claimed wisdom. Politicians who claimed to know how to govern, poets who claimed to know truth, and craftsmen who truly knew their trades. Again and again he found the same pattern. People competent in one area often assumed they were competent in all areas. They confused skill with wisdom. They mistook applause for understanding. Socrates concluded that if he was wiser, it was only in one aggravating sense. He knew he didn't know. That sounds humble. In practice, it was dynamite. Because once you admit ignorance, you can ask what you should believe and what kind of life you should live. Socrates thought most Athenians chased money, status, political influence, and pleasure without examining whether any of it made them better. He treated the unexamined life as a civic emergency. And Athens had just lived through emergencies. In the years before his trial, the city was battered by war, plague, military disaster, and political whiplash. Athens lurched between democracy and oligarchy, suffered purges, and watched trust and leadership decay. By 399 BCE, when Socrates was tried, the city was exhausted, suspicious, scarred, and hungry to blame someone for the sickness of the last generation. Enter Socrates, famous for mocking certainty, gathering intense young followers, and refusing to flatter the city's self-image. He also had the worst kind of friends, politically. Some aristocratic young men drawn to him became notorious. Alcibiades was brilliant, glamorous, reckless, and repeatedly accused of betrayal. Critias later became a leading figure in a harsh oligarchic regime that briefly ruled Athens. We can't prove Socrates taught them to do what they did, but politics rarely waits for proof. Guilt by association is an old shortcut. If you're looking for a scapegoat, you don't need a confession, you need a story people already whisper about. Comedy helped build that story. Years earlier, Aristophanes' play The Clouds presented a caricature of Socrates as a clever corrupter who disrespected the gods and taught young men to twist arguments to escape responsibilities. It was satire, but satire leaves fingerprints. For many Athenians, that cartoon became the default image, a man who dissolved tradition with words. So, when a real trial arrived, the ground was prepared. The formal charges were twofold: impiety, failing to respect the city's gods, and corrupting the youth. In other words, he was accused of being spiritually dangerous and socially dangerous, someone who made young men question their elders, their laws, and their religion. And Socrates didn't help himself by acting like Socrates. He didn't flatter the jury, he didn't perform grief, he spoke like a man who believed honesty mattered more than survival. He challenged the logic of the charges, he questioned his accusers, he asked whether anyone would corrupt the youth intentionally, since living among corrupted citizens would harm the corrupter too. He suggested that if he was doing something wrong, he should be educated, not punished. Then he delivered the line that landed like a slap. He compared himself to a gadfly, a stinging insect attached to a large, lazy horse. Athens, he implied, was the horse, strong but complacent. He was the sting that kept it awake. Imagine being a juror listening to a defendant argue, "Yes, I annoy you, and you need it." The jury found him guilty, apparently by a narrow margin. Then came the Athenian procedure that makes the story feel like a trap door. After conviction, the defendant proposes an alternative penalty, and the jury chooses between the prosecutor's request and the defendant's. This was Socrates' chance to offer exile or a substantial fine, something that would let the jury choose mercy without losing face. Instead, Socrates made a move that was either moral courage or social suicide. He suggested he deserved a reward, free meals at the public hall, and honor for benefactors and champions. Later, he did propose a fine, with friends offering to pay it, but the damage was done. In the second vote, the jury chose death. The sentence was carried out by Hemlock. Because of a religious observance, the execution was delayed, and those days in prison reveal the most human part of the story: friendship under pressure. Socrates' friends begged him to escape. They had contacts, money, routes out of the city. One loyal companion, Crito, pleaded with him, "Flee and live." In another kind of story, this is where the hero slips into exile. Socrates refused. His reasoning was consistent. Athens had raised him, protected him, and given him citizenship under its laws. If he broke the law to save himself, he would be undermining the very idea of justice he spent his life interrogating. You could argue the city was wrong, Socrates did, but to answer wrongdoing with wrongdoing was, to him, self-corruption. So when the time came, he drank the hemlock. Accounts describe him walking until his legs grew heavy, then lying down as paralysis rose upward. His friends wept. Some were angry, some shattered. Socrates, even then, reportedly urged them to control themselves, still teaching, still correcting, still being the annoying truth-teller to the end. Athens killed him, but it didn't get the peace it wanted, because the trial left a question hanging over the city. Was Socrates a criminal or a mirror? If he was guilty, then the democracy defended itself against a dangerous influence. If he was innocent, then the democracy executed a man for speaking too freely and embarrassing the wrong people. And here's the final irony. Socrates wrote nothing. What survives comes through his students and admirers, especially Plato and Xenophon, meaning his voice reached the future largely through friendship. The city tried to silence an individual and instead helped create a symbol. Socrates is remembered less for answers than for a question that won't go away. What is a good life, and how do you know? Every society claims to value truth, and every society eventually meets someone who tells the truth in an inconvenient way. Not the heroic truth that rallies crowds, but the smaller, sharper truth that exposes ego. Socrates specialized in that sting. He challenged not only policies, but identities and reputations, the comfortable stories people tell themselves. That's why he made devoted friends, and that's why he made enemies, and that's why his public trial still feels modern. A city, anxious and wounded, deciding whether it can tolerate a man who won't stop asking, "What do you mean by that?" Socrates was annoying. He was relentless. He could be smug. He was also brave enough to let his life and his death be the final argument.